I want to talk today about how it's vitally important that we get young people engaged with the question asking, the critical thinking, and the problem solving of the STEM fields. But first, a story. Now, this has been such an amazingly put together conference. There's one thing that they couldn't get for me, which was a grand piano on stage. In my perfect world, I would have gotten everybody to stand up and dance with me while I played a rock and roll song to start this off. And trust me, I gave a talk somewhat similar to this recently. You haven't witnessed hilarity until you've seen a room full of senior EU government officials dancing to the Jailhouse Rock. But imagine that we've done that, and we've all sat down after enjoying some 1950s rock and roll. When my dad was a kid, this was the music that was playing everywhere in America. You know, it was on the radio, on the TV, at the high school dances. And my dad loved it. And he wanted to be a musician so badly. He begged his mom for piano lessons. Begged and begged and begged and begged and begged. And finally the poor woman gave in. She found him a piano teacher. And he was so excited to go to his first piano lesson, because really this guy loved music. He couldn't sleep the night before the lesson. He was so excited about, thinking, what's the first song he's going to learn? Is it going to be some jazz or some rock and roll, some blues? Even something classical would be okay. And so he goes to his first piano lesson. He's sitting down next to his piano teacher, who's going to teach him the first song that he's going to learn. Like, he can barely contain his excitement. And the piano teacher shows him the song, and it goes like this. That's the song. And he's supposed to pick up a girlfriend with that. But he goes home and he learns it, and he thinks, he's mastered it. The next week he's going to learn the real song. And so the piano teacher's thrilled at his success and shows him the next song that he's going to learn. And the next week, and the next week, and the next week. A new finger exercise every week. His mother finally talks to the piano teacher and says, this guy, he's so passionate about music. And, I know the finger exercises are important to you, but do you think you could just teach him a song? Maybe do half finger exercises, half song. And the piano teacher is shocked. She's like, are you kidding me? Absolutely not. He will not be qualified to play a song for a year. He's got to do a year of the finger exercises, do a couple scales, and then after 11 to 12 months of the finger exercises, his fingers will be sufficiently limber that he can maybe begin work on a song. But when I say song, I mean some Bach or some Mozart, none of this rock and roll. And thus ended my father's brief career in music. He had a piano teacher who couldn't meet him on his level, who couldn't engage him, who couldn't get him excited. She was so caught up in this idea of how music had to be taught. These fundamental exercises had to come before any meaningful engagement, any playing of a song. So my father never touched another musical instrument for the rest of his life. He assumed that all music was like this. And I always wondered, as music became a big part of my life as a kid, what my father could have accomplished. He had tremendous musical gifts. He could listen to a song or even a symphony on the radio just once and could sing it back from memory. He had perfect pitch, so you could play a note on the piano and he could tell you which one it was without any external reference. But he never played a musical instrument. I always wondered if he'd had a teacher who could have met him where he was, what could he have accomplished? You know, maybe I could have been the kid of a rock star, which is amazing to think about. You know, and I think we'd all agree that this rote, uninspired way of teaching music is nothing that we would want for our own kids. And I think we can agree that it's not the best way to engage students in really any field. But a number of years ago, when I was a high school science teacher, I started to get worried that maybe I was being the scientific equivalent of my father's piano teacher. And I started to think more and more about that it wasn't just me, maybe it was my colleagues as well, and how much of this type of instruction was endemic in the educational system. We look at that piano teacher and we say, that's a terrible type of education. But I wasn't so sure that we weren't doing the same thing in the STEM fields. Kids show up excited about science, as excited as my father was about learning music. I would have kids come into my class and be like, I'm so fascinated about boats. Can we learn how boats float? Can we build boats? Can we figure out why some things float and other things sink? And I and my colleagues and the rest of the educational establishment would say, that's great. Boats are amazing. We'll get to that later. Boats have to do with buoyancy, and before we can understand buoyancy, we have to understand how to convert from cubic hectometers to centiliters. You cancel all the units and you convert through. We'll get to boats later. Ba, 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 ba. I'd have kids, and my colleagues would have kids who were fascinated about animals. They dreamed of being veterinarians. They wanted to learn everything. Why do cats and dogs have lots of babies, but humans tend to only have one or two? And I and my colleagues and sort of the educational establishment in general would say, oh, that's great. These are great questions. We'll eventually get to those after you memorize how we classify all of the living organisms on Earth, paying very careful attention to how we differentiate between ctenophores and cnidarians. This will all be on the test. And when I was teaching about 10 years ago, the idea of stem cells and genetic technologies, genetic engineering, and therapies were huge. Back then, 10 years ago, kids were still excited about things like Jurassic Park, and they'd come in with tons of questions about all of the DNA-related things they'd heard about on the news, and ba, 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 ba. We would say, that's great. I'm going to need you to memorize the structure of the components of DNA, memorize these definitions of what nucleotides are, and be able to reproduce these structures on one of my tests, on a standardized state exam, on an AP exam, or so forth. Again, finger exercises. The point that I started thinking about when I was a teacher really hit home when I was in grad school. I had the privilege of, while I was doing my PhD, to also be teaching summer school that the university had. And I took a bunch of students into the research lab where I was doing my grad work. I was giving them a tour of the lab and showing them the various things that we used to do the research that I was engaged in. And one of the students sort of floored me when she asked, where are all the textbooks looking around this biology lab? She's like, where are all the textbooks? Why aren't these people studying? And I didn't even understand what she meant at first until she elaborated. She said, well, science class is all about reading textbooks. It's about memorizing definitions. In the class that I take back home, we all have a shoebox full of flashcards that we work through during the year. So where are all these scientists' shoe boxes of flashcards? And she said this with complete earnesty. She was like, that's what I do in science class all day. Isn't that what scientists do? Essentially, don't they just do this stuff of ninth grade science, but at a higher, more intense level? Don't they just spend all day reading textbooks and memorizing flashcards? Which was shocking. It was like looking at a playwright rehearsing with actors and saying, I thought all you did all day was filling out grammar worksheets. Or looking at a physician who's counseling a patient through an incredibly important health decision, or watching a surgeon performing surgery and saying, I didn't think they did that. I just thought they memorized organic chemistry flashcards all day. Or going to a pianist playing a masterwork and being surprised that they just don't do finger exercises all day. There is this fundamental misunderstanding of what science was all about. And I realized that the way we often teach it in the lower grades bears very little resemblance to what the process of science actually is, to what doing science actually looks like. I've been making this analogy between some aspects of science teaching and the finger exercises for a variety of reasons. But one of them is this. Neither of them are great ways to engage kids, to get them excited, to get them really fired up about a particular subject. It's not the best way to meet students where they are and get them engaged. But these two methods of education are also similar because they're sort of both rooted in the same pedagogical idea that we can't let students meaningfully engage in a discipline until they've mastered all of the minutia of it, right? It's like we dare not let the student play a song until they've spent a year on finger exercises. We dare not teach students about genetic engineering or medical DNA techniques until they've memorized a shoebox full of definitions about DNA, right? We can't let students engage in the stuff of science until they've done all of the finger exercise prerequisites. So what then is the stuff of science? If we're saying that, the finger exercises prevent somebody like my father from getting into that stuff of music, from playing a song, what is it that we want to be getting students to engage in earlier in science? And from my perspective, it's this. It's making faces like this. It's curiosity. It's questioning. It's critical thinking. And it's problem solving. This is the stuff of what real scientists, also engineers, mathematicians, and so forth, all around the world in labs are doing all day long. They're sitting around thinking, solving problems, and figuring out the answers to questions that interest them. And I thought back, and I realized that when I was in high school, this face is the first time that I really got excited about science. I had an amazing biology teacher who was single-handedly responsible for getting me excited about the STEM fields. And he posed us a question one day. He asked us, what do plants eat? Very open-ended question. And then he elaborated. So what specifically do plants eat to get the nutrients to build wood in other parts of their bodies, right? For example, humans have to eat a lot of food, and that food then goes to build the actual physical parts of our bodies. But what about plants? Where are they getting this material to build themselves? It's a classic example of a great scientific problem. We see something in the world that interests us, and we want to solve it. And I'm actually going to pose this to the room, because the answer to this and how we investigated it still fascinates me to this day. We'll do a show of hands. We have 5 choices. And the question is, where do plants get most of the nutrients they need to build their bodies? In other words, the nutrients we need to build our bodies comes from the foods that we eat. Where do plants get the nutrients that they need to build their bodies? Show of hands. Do they pull these nutrients out of A, the air? Show of hands. Do they pull the nutrients out of B, the dirt? Is that where they're building the wood from? C, minerals in the dirt? Are they pulling their stuff from their bodies from the minerals in the dirt? D, the water? Or E, the sun? We have about a 98% non-response rate. So let's just do this again really quick. 5 choices. A, the air. Hands up. Okay, a couple people think it's from the air. B, from the dirt. They're building their bodies from the dirt. C, they're building most of their bodies from minerals in the dirt. Okay, I see a lot of hands going up now. D, they're building it from the water. Okay, a little bit from the water. And E, the sun. Okay, so they're getting a lot of it from the sun. Now, a lot of you shared the same response that I had as a 13-year-old. I think the plant absorbs most nutrients from the dirt or from minerals in the dirt. In other words, it eats dirt. Plants essentially eat dirt, and that's where their bodies come from. And so this biology teacher asks me a question I had never been asked before in any of my STEM classes, and he asks me, prove it. Or now that I am a card-carrying PhD scientist, I would revise what he said to say, support it. Because we don't really prove anything and say anyway. He says, prove it, support it, back it up, show it to be true. He says, you can use this stuff. You can use a pot of dirt, a plant, and a scale. And I do something that I had never done. I swear I had never done in a STEM class up until this point. I make these faces. These are the faces that a student makes when they are curious, when they are thinking through something, when they're trying to figure something out, when they are engaged in this authentic work of problem solving, of critical thinking. You can look at those faces. These were taken of me somewhat unknowingly when I was working through a problem during my PhD. You see these faces, and you can literally see the mental gears turning. And I thought, and I worked with some other team members on this, and we come up with a pretty simple idea. We'll use the dirt to show that plants eat dirt. We'll start with this pot of dirt. We'll weigh the dirt. We get 1.2 kilograms. We plant a tiny little seedling in the dirt, and we let it grow. It'll start as a tiny little seedling, and then it grows. And eventually, to prove that plants eat the dirt, we weigh it. And to my surprise and horror, after a couple weeks, I find out that the plant weighs something like 15.2 kilograms, and the dirt weighs exactly the amount that it did when we started out. Exactly. There is no loss of mass whatsoever, and the plant now weighs more than the dirt ever did. So there's no way it was eating the dirt. It turns out the plants don't eat dirt. And for those of you who participated in our poll a minute ago, not only do plants eat dirt, but the answer to this question is truly mind-boggling. Plants get most of their nutrients from the air around us. They pull in carbon dioxide, and using energy from the sun, they turn this gas carbon dioxide that's everywhere around us, they turn it into essentially solid wood, right? So when you have something like this, it's made out of wood, this, like 200 years ago, was somebody's breath in the air. Somebody breathed this out, and plants pulled in that carbon dioxide and put it together with the help of a little water, the help of a little sun, and turned it into this solid wood. Like, if that's not like mind-blowing, like, I don't know what is. Like, every time I see like a wooden table or something, I'm like, that used to, quite literally, that used to be somebody's breath. But what made this realization so fascinating for me was that we discovered one part of it ourselves by thinking through this. And then the other part of it is that primed us to understand and appreciate the next part of it. When my teacher explained this idea of photosynthesis, of creating solid wood from the carbon dioxide and water, as well as some sunlight, and explained it in simple terms that we as 13-year-olds could understand. Now, I guarantee that everybody has read or has been exposed to material that explains this concept. Chances are it was in an easy-to-digest sentence like this. Photosynthesis is a biological process in which carbon from inorganic sources is fixed or assimilated by living things to produce carbohydrates, typically using energy from solar radiation, which is entirely true, but is not always the best way to engage young learners. When I think back to the student who is visiting my lab, I'm sure somewhere in her shoebox full of flashcards, she had one that said photosynthesis on the front and had that definition or a similar one on the back. But simply memorizing that doesn't engage her or anybody else in the fundamental process of science, of A, thinking things through, trying to critically discover something new, being curious, and finding an answer. All of these I was able to do with this relatively simple experiment and follow-up that first got me excited about science years ago. Plants, as we said, have this remarkable ability to make their food from carbon dioxide, and sunlight provides the energy that makes this process happen. This, too, may be a much more engaging way to explain it to kids, and it's very important that engaging, accessible explanations like this be part of how we teach. At the same time, simply memorizing that definition still doesn't always engage students in the critical thinking, the problem solving of figuring something out. And then as we go into much more molecular detail, once again, a simple memorization of this very key element of the photosynthetic process is, again, not necessarily engaging of the critical thinking that is such an important part of science. So, how can we do this? How can we better change the way we teach to give more students the opportunity to make these faces of mental gear work and real deep engagement with the material? I'm sometimes disappointed at the dual nature of how we present science and science education to students. This is a textbook, by and large, that I like quite a bit. Though it was not published by Macmillan, it was written by my mentor in college, a guy that I really, really look up to, a brilliant professor who taught the intro biology class at the university that I went to. I think the world of this guy. But in the intro to his textbook, he says, You don't need a lab coat or a degree or a laboratory to be a scientist. What you do need is an inquiring mind, the patience to look at nature carefully, and the willingness to figure things out. I would agree wholeheartedly with Ken Miller about what he says. I would, though, have to be fair and say that the textbook that he presents gives students essentially zero opportunities to use their inquiring mind, to look at nature carefully, or to figure everything out. Everything that they need to know is presented to them in very difficult to digest pieces of text where the punchline, the kicker, the conclusion is already served up for them. There's no need to think their way through a problem because we jump right to the answer every single time. Looking through a high school textbook like this one, students just often won't have the opportunity to engage in that true stuff of science. And I often hear from students who take, often because of a requirement, something like a shop class or an automobile mechanics class, and I'm always surprised to hear how much they like it. And in many cases, many automobile maintenance courses have more critical thinking than the science classes that we typically present to young learners. A student who has to figure out why a car won't work is engaged in problem solving and critical thinking that they rarely get in a biology or a chemistry class. A car won't start, so you immediately have to think, is there enough gas in the car? How do I test this? Is there a charge in the battery? How do I test this? Well, is a starter motor running? How do I test this? Is a starter motor broken? So on and so forth. A perfect illustration of the scientific method. Curious about something, we need to come to some sort of a conclusion. We have to test and do controlled experiments at each point. There are ways that we can be cognizant of this type of critical thinking and incorporate it into the curriculum when we can. We have to be mindful that sometimes, all too often in teaching, we give away the punchline. We give away the answer before students have the chance to discover it for themselves. All too often we just tell students that, well, motion in the horizontal direction continues with constant speed, and in the vertical direction it speeds up with constant acceleration exactly as dropped. Although I've seen amazing teachers be able to have students come to the same conclusion after only a 15 or 20-minute activity with their smartphones, some clever photography, some video filming, and they're able to essentially reconstruct this figure from the textbook on their own and discover one of these fundamental principles of physics themselves. And in the process of doing so, are able to engage in critical thinking, problem solving, the stuff of science, and realize that this subject is an inherently creative one. This really is the content for an entire talk in itself, but we can also think about, instead of giving students a formula right away and telling them, again, what the punchline is, giving them data sets and allowing them to work through it and discover the relationship between different variables. Many students can look at problem sets and figure out what the formula would be that describes a relationship between two things. We often talk about experimentation in the engineering fields, and it's incredibly important that we have students building things. It was so cool to hear the Fab Lab talk that you guys presented earlier. And engineering always seems to lend itself very well, if it's being taught correctly, to the idea of hands-on creation and the engineering design process. But all too frequently, we forget that science, too, is something that is hands-on. Science has a process of experimentation as well. I'm so happy to see that students have the opportunity to play with Arduinos and that they have the opportunity to use CNC mills and laser printers and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, we have to understand that science, too, not just engineering, but science has a cognitive, critical thinking, problem-solving component as well. We can also present experiments that we could never safely do in the lab, like injecting mice with deadly bacteria, and simply presenting this as thought problems to students so they can work their way through and form their own conclusions. In a tiny pitch for another project that I've worked on, I partnered with Google to create a virtual reality trip through a human cell, which allows students to put on one of these cardboard viewers and look around and explore the cell the same way they would a city. Look around and see how various parts interact with each other to get an intuitive feel of it, the same way we would get to understand a city by sitting on a street corner and seeing how various people and objects interact. Again, nobody's memorizing definitions, but they're able to understand how things fit together in a much more intuitive way, and again, working through this sort of critical thinking, curiosity, and figuring things out. I want to leave you on this note. I always think about the piano lessons and my dad, and I always do wonder what he could have been as a musician if he'd known that the process of music, of being a musician, wasn't just about finger exercises on the piano. I've been thinking with equal parts shock and horror recently, how many students in science are like my dad in music? How many students who would be amazing scientists got turned off because instead of realizing that science was about creativity and problem solving and critical thinking, they thought it was only about memorization, shoeboxes full of flashcards and lots of these finger exercises. It terrifies me to think about how many Nobel Prizes, how many cures to cancer, how many solutions to our energy problems are locked away in the minds of students who got turned off from science because they thought it was only a bunch of scientific finger exercises. And so I hope that as we think about moving ahead into the sort of education system, the sort of STEM education that we want in the future, we can realize that not every single lesson needs to be about critical thinking and problem solving. It needs to be part of a healthy diet of science education. But still, it's critical that we show students that science and all the STEM fields are more than just the finger exercises, that there is a whole cognitive realm out there that they'll be excited to explore. We owe it to them to show them what science is, what it can be, and hopefully we'll get them excited to show us new steps into the future. Thank you.